So Zack is a legal fellow and manager of the Supreme Court and Appellate Advocacy Program and the Edwin Meese Center for Legal and Judicial Studies at the Heritage Foundation. We had another representative from the Edwin Meese Center, John Malcolm, just here joining us about a month ago to celebrate the Constitution Day. He previously served for several years as an assistant U.S. attorney in the Northern District of Florida. Prior to that, he spent 2 years as an associate in the Washington, D.C. office of Cleary, Gottlieb, Steen, and Hamilton. Did I get that right? All right, I can speak my legal. Which he joined after clerking for the Honorable Emmett Cox on the United States Court of Appeals for the 11th Circuit. Smith received his undergraduate, master's, and law degrees from the University of Florida. During law school, Smith served as the editor of Florida. Hey, University of Florida, are they the ones getting a new president? Yeah, Ben Sass, if he can survive the challenges he's having there. During law school, Smith served as the editor-in-chief of the Florida Law Review and served on the executive boards of several student organizations, including the UF chapter of the Federalist Society. Friends, please welcome Zack Smith. Thank you, guys. Turn it over to you. Thanks, Zack.
Well, thank you all so much for having me here today. And I just want to echo what everyone else has said. I want to thank Jeff and the folks at the Centennial Institute for having us. This has been a fantastic program so far. But we just heard from 3 experts in law enforcement. And so I'm here to talk about the other side of the coin, if you will. How many of you have watched Law & Order before? Do you remember that show? Yeah. Well, the opening of every episode of Law & Order, the announcer always said, in the criminal justice system, the people are represented by 2 separate yet equally important groups, the police who investigate crimes and the district attorneys who prosecute the offenders. So we just heard from several police officers, and I'm here to talk about the prosecution piece. As Jeff mentioned, my background, I'm a former assistant United States attorney, a former federal prosecutor. And a couple of years ago, after I'd started at the Heritage Foundation, one of my colleagues, Cully Stimson, who is also a former state and federal prosecutor, we started to notice a couple of strange things happening around the country. We saw reports of prosecutors who were deciding not to prosecute certain crimes, particularly drug-related crimes. In many states and cities, even where marijuana was illegal, these prosecutors were choosing not to bring charges. They were pleading down many offenders. And we started hearing this same thing over and over and over again. So we decided to take a look into it. And what we found out, it troubled us quite a bit. And so we started researching and writing on it. And we've really been covering this beat for the past 2.5 years or so. It's a movement, we've dubbed it the rogue prosecutor movement, because many of these prosecutors are refusing to do their jobs and enforce duly enacted laws, particularly in the drug enforcement context. But many of these folks claim themselves to be progressives, that their policies are going to help the individuals who may suffer from addiction. Now that's wrong, and I'll tell you why in just a minute. And they also claim that they can actually implement their what I think are radical non-prosecution policies and actually see crime rates go down. Well, that's false too, and I'll tell you why in just a few minutes as well. But I thought in my brief time I have with you here today, I could essentially do 3 things. We could start and go over the background of this rogue prosecutor movement, where it comes from, who's supporting it, where the money's coming from. Then we can talk a little bit about their radical policies, their goals, and then we can finish things up with the consequences of these radical policies, and most importantly, what all of us can be aware of and what we can do to push back against them. So in terms of the background, where did this come from? Where did this idea come from? We actually have to go back to the 60s and 70s. The 60s and 70s, there was a radical time in the United States, and there's actually a movement called the prison abolition movement. Believe it or not, there was a group of people that thought we shouldn't have any prisons in the United States. Now, that was a radical movement for the time. It's a radical movement today. It was a movement that had Marxist roots. And unfortunately, some of the primary ideas of that prison abolition movement have garnered traction over the last several decades. Now, a lot of times when we hear these ideas today, we don't hear people often say that we don't need prisons, because that sounds radical, and it is radical. But you may have heard someone say we have a mass incarceration problem in our country. That's a myth. If you look, as several of our speakers have already said, if you look at who is actually in prison today, it's not nonviolent first-time drug offenders. By and large, it is repeat violent offenders who have additional charges besides drug charges that they're currently serving time for. And so whenever someone tells you that we have a mass incarceration problem and that we need to reduce our prison population, it necessarily means releasing some of these repeat violent offenders from office. So that's the first myth that a lot of these so-called reformers have bought into, that we have a mass incarceration problem. The second myth that's really been pushed is that our criminal justice system is systemically racist. It's not. And that's a very unfortunate myth, because as I'll talk about when we get to the consequences section in just a few minutes, if you look at who is actually being disproportionately victimized when crime rates increase, it's actually minority members of our communities who by and large suffer the consequences of increased crime rates, particularly violent crime rates, particularly gun crimes and homicides. And so these are very pernicious myths that have had a lot of very bad consequences across our legal system. So that's the theory. This kind of started in the 60s with the prison abolition movement, with Marxist ideologies, and it's continued today. But we really started to see it take shape in 2015 or so. It was in 2015 that a couple of radical organizers who were against the death penalty decided they wanted to try to elect anti-death penalty district attorneys, particularly in Mississippi and Louisiana, but they needed a funder, somebody to do that. And so they went to George Soros. Now, there are other billionaires as well, Dustin Moskowitz, Carrie Tuna, his wife, who are involved in Facebook and other tech enterprises. But George Soros is certainly the most prominent funder of many of these radical policies. And so in 2015, they went to George Soros and some other folks, and they said, look, if we get a little bit of money, we think we can take on these pro-death penalty district attorneys and make a difference. And the reason they wanted to take on the district attorneys is because they figured out in a lot of ways the local elected DA, in some places they're called state's attorneys, in some places they're called other names, but it's essentially the local elected prosecutor is the linchpin to the criminal justice system. Police officers can go out, do their jobs, investigate crimes, make arrests, but as we heard the sheriff tell us just a few minutes ago, if the local DAs won't prosecute the cases, if they won't seek bail for individuals, the investigation and police work really doesn't matter. The same thing on the other side of the coin. Many states have very strong sentencing laws, very strong sentencing enhancements, but those can never be applied if the prosecutor doesn't bring a case. So it's very clever in a very diabolical way that by getting their so-called reformers in these local DA offices, they could essentially short-circuit our criminal justice system. And so in 2015, after that election cycle, there was some success electing these anti-death penalty DAs in Louisiana and Mississippi, and so they took the enterprise nationwide. And it's in 2016 that we really saw for the first time a nationwide push in many of our nation's biggest cities to get these radical rogue district attorneys put in office. So if you look in places like Chicago, where Kim Foxx is currently in office, she is a rogue Soros-backed district attorney. The same thing happened in Philadelphia with Larry Krasner. The same thing happened in St. Louis with Kim Gardner. And I can keep going down the list, but the list goes on and on and on. And it's going to continue to grow over the next several years because these individuals have figured out. They've had success. They've seen success getting their policies implemented, and they're going to continue to do so. Now, one of the reasons that George Soros and the other liberal billionaire backers have had so much success in these races is you have to understand, traditionally, local district attorney races have been very low-profile affairs. Many times an incumbent runs uncontested. If the incumbent is retiring or leaving office, it's often a deputy or almost a hand-picked successor that will take place. And the campaign contributions in many of these races, even in big cities, are minimal. A six-figure fundraising event for a local district attorney candidate, that's a good day in most of these races. Well, what we saw in 2016 with Kim Foxx and later with Larry Krasner is that either directly or indirectly, George Soros and his fellow billionaires, they were contributing seven figures to these races. In some instances, in many instances actually, they were making up the bulk of these candidates' campaign contributions, and they were many, many times over what their opponents were able to raise and spend. And I also want to point out, it's not like these so-called reformers were targeting Republican district attorneys necessarily. They are not discriminating based on partisan affiliation. They're not discriminating based on race or gender. One of their most prominent targets that they went after in Los Angeles was Jackie Lacey. Jackie Lacey is a Democrat. I disagree with Jackie Lacey on many issues, but she was essentially a traditional law and order prosecutor. She understood the need for public safety. She understood that her role was to seek justice for victims and to hold criminals accountable. She was the first elected African-American female district attorney in Los Angeles County. And yet she is one of the individuals that George Soros and others decided to target and replace with a radical district attorney, George Gascon. And the crime rates in Los Angeles have gone absolutely through the roof. If you just Google George Gascon, you can see many horrific stories about his very radical non-prosecution policies. My colleague, Cully Stimson, and I, we actually wrote a white paper outlining many of his radical non-prosecution policies. They include things like not seeking bail for most offenders. They include things like deciding unilaterally not to enforce certain duly enacted laws that are on the books. They include policies like seeking early release for many criminals. They include policies like no longer allowing his deputies to attend parole hearings to advocate for victims and their families when many of these violent offenders come up for parole. And so the host of bad policies just goes on and on and on. And we're seeing this nationwide. Essentially, wherever these rogue prosecutors have gotten into office, they are, by and large, singing from the same sheet of music. And the reason for this is that not only are the direct or indirect campaign contributions being sent to many of these prosecutors, we're also seeing an entire infrastructure being erected to support these radical prosecutors and the policies that they're pushing. There have been think tank-like organizations established on the left. One of the most prominent ones is a group named Fair and Just Prosecution. That name is, I think, ironic because the policies they're advocating for are neither fair nor just. But if you look at the policy positions these organizations like Fair and Just Prosecution are putting out, they're being adopted by the rogue prosecutors in many of these cities. And just to give you an idea of how much money George Soros has poured into these races over the past several years, a conservative estimate is that in either direct or indirect campaign contributions, he's given about $40 million over the past several years. Some organizations who have looked at this think that once you take into account the other support infrastructure, the 501c3 giving, that sort of thing, the actual contributions could be closer to $1 billion. So it's an absolute tsunami of cash that is being infused into many of these local district attorney races. Now, that's the background. But what are some of these policies that are being implemented? I've mentioned some of them. What's very troubling about many of these policies is that anyone who's taken basic high school civics or watched Schoolhouse Rock understands that's supposed to be the legislature, our elected representatives, that make the laws, either at the federal level in Congress or in the states in our state legislatures. And the state legislatures have decided certain things should be crimes with certain penalties attached. And if we don't like those laws, there's a mechanism to change it. We can either get different legislators elected, we can lobby our current legislators to change the law, or in some cases, we may be able to do it through a ballot referendum in the states. But what these individuals have figured out is that they can achieve many of the same policy goals in the much easier and more cost-effective way by just not prosecuting crimes. And so our focus here today has been on drug policy, by and large. But what many of these prosecutors have done, they've said, we're not going to prosecute what we deem to be quality of life crimes. Now, I think that's a misnomer for a lot of reasons, but essentially they say these are harmless crimes. They don't really impact anyone. They don't impact public safety. So we're not going to prosecute things like petty theft. We heard shoplifting under $1,000 in many instances. They said we're not going to prosecute things like prostitution. We're not going to prosecute things like simple possession. And in many cases, it's not just simple possession of things like marijuana, it's any illegal narcotic. And so when you look at all of these policies in combination, well, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out what the consequence is going to be. Another aspect of their policies that they have been very vocal about is many of these rogue prosecutors are advocates of so-called bail reform. Now, in practice, what that means is they are against holding essentially anyone pre-trial, regardless of their criminal history, regardless of what danger they may pose to the community, regardless of their flight risk. And so we heard the sheriff and the chief and others talk about the revolving door that's essentially been established in many communities. And so again, you can have police officers going out, doing their jobs, making arrests, but to what end? If the offender isn't even going to be held in jail for any appreciable period of time, and certainly if they're not going to face any consequences. And so to the sheriff's point, criminals, for all of their flaws, they are smart. They understand the rules of the game, and they certainly understand the message that many of these rogue prosecutors are sending, that certain activities that our elected representatives in either Congress or for these local DAs, their state legislators have said are not appropriate and that should be criminally punished. They understand that the message is now these activities will be tolerated. And that's had a host of bad consequences for communities. And particularly this idea that there's certain quality of life crimes that can be tolerated without consequences is just nonsense. I mean, look at what has happened in cities like San Francisco and Los Angeles and Chicago. I think it's important to understand what is actually happening there. Let's talk about petty theft for a minute. Often, petty theft accompanies drug legalization or where drug use is rampant because it's how many addicts feed their habit. And so what we've seen in many of these jurisdictions is the explosion of petty theft going through the roof, and the same people committing this theft time and time again because they're not being held without bail, and they're also not being sentenced, held accountable for their actions. And so as a result of that, San Francisco in particular, they've seen many stores close. CVS and Walgreens have closed locations, Target has reduced hours, and mom and pop shops have been particularly hard hit. And so this idea that there are no consequences to the community quickly falls away. But I think it's also important to realize, again, who is being most impacted by these consequences. For most of us, if our closest CVS or Walgreens closes, it's an inconvenience, but it may not be that big of a deal. We can still get the medication we need, we can still shop for groceries, but if you're a poor member of the community who depends on public transportation or being able to walk to your local pharmacy, if you're a poor member of the community who depends on those extended hours so that you can go to the pharmacy either before or after work, those closures are a big, big deal and are going to impact your life in a much more real way than many of these rogue prosecutors are willing or able to admit. And so it's just a shameful cycle that's being perpetuated time and time again. Now, there's also another myth that many of these rogue prosecutors and their backers push. They've labeled themselves progressives, and the term progressive usually indicates that some progress is being made. Something is being made better, right? And I hear the chuckles and the laughters because you're right. I think it's pretty clear that is not the case here. And so if you listen to what many of these radical prosecutors are saying, you would think that traditional prosecutors have been locking up and seeking very exorbitant sentences for even first-time nonviolent offenders. That's just not the case. In many sense, traditional law and order prosecutors have been and continue to be the true progressives. If you look, it's been traditional prosecutors that have been at the forefront of advocating things for like mental health courts, drug treatment courts, veterans courts, alternative programs. But the key distinction between those types of programs and what is being advocated for now is that with those traditional programs, there's still accountability. And there's still consequences if someone cannot or will not successfully complete their terms. So if someone won't complete their rehab stint, the charges can still be reinstated, and that person can still be criminally prosecuted with potentially a prison sentence attached to it. Whereas today, essentially what you're seeing is no prosecution, no treatment being provided, or really any enforcement mechanism to make someone get the help that they may very well need. I know this will shock many of you, but unfortunately, many addicts don't want to go to rehab or don't want to get the help that they need. And so having that incentive there is crucially important. Now, what have the results of these policies been? We've talked about some of the store closures in places like San Francisco, Philadelphia, and other places, but the consequences have been absolutely disastrous in cities where these rogue prosecutors have been in power. Look at what's happened in Chicago and Philadelphia. These are just two examples. The gun violence rate there in both of these cities are through the roof. Gun crimes have gone up, murders have gone up, and Cully and I, if you go to heritage.org/rogue prosecutors, you can see everything that Cully and I have written on this topic. We have several research or linked white papers we've written. We have several shorter blog and op-eds that we've written about specific prosecutors in specific cities. But in one of our articles, we actually compared the homicide and shooting gun crime rate in Chicago to the casualty rate that occurred in Iraq and Afghanistan at the height of military operations there. And guess what? The city of Chicago has more shooting injuries than the United States military did during the same time period as the surge in Iraq. And so that is absolutely mind-boggling when you think about that. But before our talk today, I actually pulled some crime statistics in Denver to see what's been happening in Denver over the past several years. And the reason I pulled the crime statistics in Denver is because Denver actually has a rogue prosecutor. She's not one of the highest profile on the national stage rogue prosecutors, but she's certainly sympathetic to the movement. She's been involved with many meetings of fair and just prosecution. And it's Denver's District Attorney, Beth McCann. And unfortunately, she is advocating for many of these same soft on crime policies that we've been talking about here today. And so I pulled the crime stats, and I got these from official police department websites, and I actually got many of them from the Denver Post as well, who have ran stories on what's been happening. So in 2022, compared to this same point in 2021, basically if you take today, compared to this same date in 2021, this is how much each one of these types of crimes have increased. Overall, violent crime is up 8.3% in Denver. Property crime is up 5.9%. Domestic violent crimes are up 17.3%. Sexual assaults are up 13.6%. Serious assaults are up 9.2%. Robberies are up 4.3%. Car thefts are up 21.2%, and drug crimes are up 29.7%. And just to put this in more of a fuller context, if you look at this increase compared to the average of these types of crimes over the past 3-year period preceding 2022, sexual assaults, robberies, murders, and aggravated assaults combined are up 28.4%. over the average from the past 3 years. And we heard the chief just a few minutes ago talk about the problem with auto thefts and other car-related crimes. I think this statistic will shock you. Auto thefts are up 78% compared to the 3-year average over the previous 3 years. And it's by and large because these prosecutors are refusing to do their jobs and to hold these individuals accountable. I talked about how criminals aren't stupid, how they understand the message that is being sent. And an interesting anecdote illustrating that is, it comes from Los Angeles, with George Gascon. Once he released his policy proposal that he was no longer going to seek sentencing enhancements in many violent crimes, that he was going to seek early release for many violent offenders who are currently incarcerated in California's prison, there's actually a viral video on social media that made the rounds. It was 2 inmates who were incarcerated in California, clinking their glasses, making a toast to George Gascon with prison-made wine, essentially, toasting his radical policies. And so I think that's fundamentally the issue we are seeing time and time again. These rogue prosecutors, in an effort to, and their word is, fundamentally reimagine the criminal justice system, they're really subverting justice in many cases. They're failing to realize that their job is to seek justice, for victims, to seek justice for the offenders. They fail to understand their role in our system of government. These are executive branch officials who have taken an oath to uphold and faithfully execute the laws as they are written. They are not lawmakers. Unfortunately, they're essentially functioning in that role when they refuse to prosecute duly enacted crimes. They're usurping the role of the state legislatures, and it just creates havoc in our entire system of government. So what can we do about it? That's the important question. I'll be honest, at the federal level, there's not much we can do about these local elected DAs. There's some funding, some federal grants that are given to the states that can be either pared back or certain conditions that can be tied to them. The problem with that, though, to be honest, is many of these grants go to local law enforcement agencies. Many are used for victims' services. And so you'd essentially be penalizing local law enforcement for the sins of these prosecutors. But there is some grant money that could be impacted. But by and large, this is a state and local issue. And so it's important to make clear to your state legislators that this type of conduct from these local district attorneys is unacceptable. And different states have different mechanisms for ways to deal with these local DAs. I mean, as a threshold matter, the most important thing you can do is know who's running for office and know what their policies are. And so if you hear individuals running for office, and this is whether they're Republican or Democrat, any party, if they talk about a more equal justice system, a fairer justice system, that sounds good. I think most of us want equal justice to be applied in a colorblind way, regardless of your race, your ethnicity, regardless of how rich or how poor you are. We all want equal justice. But drill down, understand what they mean by that. Because what we've seen in many of these rogue prosecutor races is that these rogue prosecutors have used those types of phrases time and again. But it quickly becomes apparent once they get into office what they mean by these phrases and what you or I or the average person on the street would understand these phrases to mean is something radically different. And so know what they're saying. Know who's backing these candidates. If you see them participating or signing on to statements from Fair and Just Prosecution or other organizations like that, that should be a red flag, that they likely buy into this rogue radical ideology. And then in terms of more immediate things that can be done, some states, like Pennsylvania, have mechanisms in place to impeach local district attorneys. We're seeing that effort against Larry Krasner now. I don't know if it'll be successful because of the number of votes that are needed in the Pennsylvania Senate. Some states allow for the suspension or removal of local elected officials if they're not doing their duty or if they're violating the law. We saw this in my home state of Florida, where Governor Ron DeSantis suspended the Tampa area prosecutor, Andrew Warren. Some states allow for recalls. Colorado allows for recalls of local elected officials and statewide officials in some instances, but we have seen some success with this. Take, for instance, San Francisco. San Francisco is not a conservative bastion by any stretch of the imagination, but even in San Francisco, things got so bad, the voters there recalled their rogue district attorney, Chesa Boudin, and kicked him out of office. And so we're starting to see, as people become more aware of what these policies are, as people start becoming more aware of what the consequences of these policies are, people are starting to stand up and push back against them. And that is a very good thing, not only for us as a country, but also for the communities that are being devastated in many ways by these rogue radical policies. And so I just want to say thank you all again for giving me the time today to talk about this very important issue. I think it flies under the radar a lot of times because, local DA races have traditionally been very low dollar, low profile affairs. But at the end of the day, in many ways, the local elected district attorney really is the key to the criminal justice system. And a local DA's job is to seek justice for victims, keep communities safe, and really uphold the integrity of their office, which we're not seeing in many of our nation's largest cities right now. So if you're interested, please go to heritage.org. You can see everything Cully and I have written about rogue prosecutors. And if I can help with anything or chat with anyone further, I am more than happy to do that. Thank you all for having me.